In a courtroom where justice is supposed to be blind, Judge Victoria Marshall finds herself face to face with a defendant she never expected. Daniel Carter, her childhood friend. Accused of a crime that could ruin his life, Daniel stands before her, shackled and judged by a system that has never been fair to men like him. As the trial unfolds, Victoria must decide, does the law always serve justice, or is it just another form of control? This story will make you question everything you believe about fairness, truth, and the cost of silence. Stay until the end, because this is a lesson none of us can afford to ignore. Hi everyone, welcome to Narrated Tales, where every story touches the heart. Today I am very happy to share a new story with you. Let's get started. The courtroom was buzzing with the usual hum of anticipation. Lawyers whispering in hushed tones, clerks shuffling papers, the faint creak of wooden benches as spectators adjusted their seats. Judge Victoria Marshall sat tall at the bench, her hands resting lightly on the polished oak, her expression unreadable as she surveyed the room. It was just another case, or so she thought. The bailiff cleared his throat and called out, "The state of Illinois versus Daniel Carter." Victoria's grip on her gavel tightened slightly. The name struck her with a strange sense of familiarity, but she didn't have time to process it. The door at the side of the room opened, and two officers escorted the defendant in. The moment she saw him, her world tilted. Daniel Carter, handcuffed at the wrists, his posture weary but still holding on to some remnant of dignity, was not just another defendant. He was her Daniel. Her breath caught in her throat. It had been decades since she had last seen him, but there was no mistaking those deep, intelligent eyes, the strong jawline now roughened with years of hardship. His shoulders, once broad with the confidence of youth, were now slumped slightly forward, as if burdened by something heavier than just the chains around his wrists. He looked up at her, and for the briefest moment, recognition flickered in his eyes. But it was quickly replaced with something else. Resignation, as if he had expected this. Expected to be standing before someone who once knew him, yet could do nothing to change his fate. He cast his gaze downward again, his lips pressing into a tight line. Victoria felt her pulse quicken. Memories long buried under years of law school, ambition, and the rigid expectations of her career crashed over her like waves. Daniel. She saw them as kids running barefoot through the narrow alleys of Chicago's South Side, daring each other to steal apples from the old grocer's cart. She remembered the warm summer nights when they would lie on the rooftop of his family's tiny apartment, staring at the stars, dreaming about places far beyond their neighborhood. "You ever think about leaving here?" he had asked once, his voice quiet but firm. "Really leaving?" She had laughed then, not taking it seriously. But Daniel had been different. Even as a child, he had seen the world for what it was, a place where some people were meant to succeed and others were expected to fail. But now he was standing before her, accused of armed robbery and assault. Victoria forced herself to push the past aside. She was a judge, a neutral figure of justice. This case would not be about her personal history with the defendant. She adjusted her posture, clearing her throat. Her voice came out steady, despite the storm raging inside her. "Mr. Carter," she began, "you stand accused of robbery and assault. How do you plead?" For the first time since entering the room, Daniel lifted his head fully, his gaze locked onto hers, unreadable. Then in a voice that was both hoarse and defiant, he spoke, "Not guilty, Your Honor." Something about the way he said it made Victoria's fingers tighten around the gavel. The prosecutor, Richard Owens, a stocky man with graying hair and a reputation for being relentless, stood up from his seat. "Your Honor, the state is prepared to present evidence that will prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant—" Victoria barely heard him, because Daniel hadn't looked away. His eyes weren't pleading. They weren't desperate. They were waiting, as if he was silently asking her something. And Victoria realized with a sinking feeling in her gut that this wasn't just another case. This was personal. And no matter how hard she tried to bury the past, it was about to collide head-on with the present. The courtroom air felt heavier as the prosecutor, Richard Owens, strode toward the jury box, his voice measured but sharp. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about violence and intent. The defendant, Daniel Carter, was apprehended near the scene of the crime. Money still on him, his fingerprints on the counter, and a witness ready to identify him. We are confident that by the end of this trial, you will see the truth as we do. Daniel Carter is guilty. Victoria Marshall sat still, maintaining her practiced neutral expression, but her pulse was racing. The defense attorney, Lauren Bishop, a woman known for her tenacity in court, rose to speak. She adjusted her glasses before addressing the jury. The prosecution would like you to believe this is an open and shut case, she began, but I urge you to pay close attention, because things are not always what they seem. My client has pleaded not guilty, and we intend to show you why that plea is justified. There is more to this story than the prosecution would have you believe. Lauren's voice was steady, but Victoria could feel the unspoken battle beneath her words. This wasn't just about a legal defense. This was about a man fighting for his life. Victoria inhaled slowly. She couldn't let herself be swayed. The prosecution's first witness was the store clerk, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a nervous expression. He adjusted his tie as he took the stand. Mr. Reynolds, Owens began, please tell the jury what happened on the night of the robbery. The clerk cleared his throat. It was around 9:45 p.m. A man came in wearing a dark hoodie, walked straight to the counter. He seemed agitated. Then out of nowhere, he lunged over the counter and grabbed the cash from the register. I tried to stop him, but he hit me. Murmurs spread across the courtroom. Victoria's grip on the gavel tightened. Owens stepped forward. And is the man who attacked you present in this courtroom today? The clerk nodded hesitantly, pointing to Daniel. That's him. Victoria turned her gaze toward Daniel. He sat still, his expression calm, but his fingers were curled into fists on his lap. Lauren stood. Mr. Reynolds, let me clarify. You didn't see his face clearly, did you? The clerk hesitated. Well, because, Lauren continued, you originally told the police that the robber had a hood pulled over his head. Is that correct? The clerk swallowed. Yes, but... And you were also in a state of distress, were you not? Yes, but... Lauren held up a printed copy of the police report. In your statement that night, you said, and I quote, I think he was a tall black man, but I didn't get a good look at him. Is that accurate? The courtroom shifted uneasily. Owen stood quickly. Objection. The witness identified the defendant today. Lauren turned to the judge. Your Honor, the prosecution is relying on a shaky eyewitness testimony, despite the fact that the witness was under duress and could not clearly identify the suspect at the time of the crime. Victoria let out a slow breath. She had no choice but to allow the challenge. Overruled, she said. Continue, Ms. Bishop. Lauren nodded. Mr. Reynolds, I'm not saying you're lying, but I am asking, is it possible you're mistaken? The clerk's jaw tightened. I don't know. I thought it was him. Lauren stepped back. No further questions? Victoria exhaled. The foundation of the prosecution's case had just cracked, but it wasn't over. The next piece of evidence was surveillance footage from the convenience store. The grainy black and white video played on the screen, showing a figure in a dark hoodie entering the store, moving toward the counter. This is our suspect, Owens declared. This footage clearly shows the same height, same build as the defendant. Lauren stood. Your Honor, we do not see a face. We cannot confirm the identity of the person in this video. All we have is an assumption. Owens smirked. Assumption or strong circumstantial evidence? Victoria watched the jury carefully. Some nodded at Owens' argument. Others remained unconvinced. Lauren wasn't done. Your Honor, she said, turning to Victoria, the timestamps on this footage are inconsistent. We have a forensic analyst ready to testify that this video was edited before being submitted as evidence. Gasp spread across the room. Victoria's heartbeat thundered in her ears. Owens looked furious. That's not proven. Victoria couldn't ignore it. The defense may proceed. Lauren called her expert witness, a forensic technician. The man took the stand and explained how metadata from the footage had been altered, meaning there was no guarantee that the video had captured the crime in real time. The prosecution sputtered with objections, but the damage had been done. Then finally, Daniel Carter took the stand. Lauren approached him, her voice softer than before. Daniel, I need you to tell the jury, where were you the night of the crime? Daniel inhaled deeply. I was walking home from a friend's house. Did you enter that store? No. His voice was firm. Lauren nodded. What happened when you were arrested? Daniel clenched his jaw. They stopped me, searched me. I had $40 in my pocket, the same amount they said was stolen. They didn't ask questions. They didn't listen. They just threw me in cuffs. Lauren turned to the jury. And did they find a hoodie? The hoodie that's supposedly in the video? No, Daniel answered. Silence. Owens stood for cross-examination. He circled Daniel like a predator sizing up prey. You say you were just walking home, Owens sneered. But you have a criminal record, don't you? Mr. Carter? Lauren objected immediately. Irrelevant. He is not on trial for his past. Victoria took a slow, deep breath. She turned to Owens. Sustained. Stay on topic, Mr. Owens. Owens gritted his teeth, then looked back at Daniel. Tell me this. If you weren't the robber, why did you run? Daniel's expression hardened. I didn't run. He lifted his hands, showing the scars on his wrist from the handcuffs. I got tackled. I never had a chance to explain myself. The jury shifted uncomfortably. Victoria exhaled. This wasn't just a case anymore. This was a fight between law and truth, and she had the power to decide which one won. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. The final arguments had been made, and now the fate of Daniel Carter rested in the hands of the jury. Victoria Marshall sat at the bench, her fingers interlaced, her expression unreadable, but inside a storm was raging. She had spent years upholding the law, believing in the system. Yet today, she wasn't sure if the system was built to serve justice or simply to maintain order. The evidence against Daniel was flimsy, circumstantial at best. But would the jury see past the surface? Or would they, like so many before them, let fear and bias dictate their decision? The jury had been deliberating for hours. The courtroom had emptied and refilled as people stretched, whispered, waited. Daniel sat quietly, his fingers tapping against his knee. He hadn't looked at Victoria once since the trial began, and she couldn't blame him. She glanced at Lauren Bishop, the defense attorney, who sat beside Daniel, her lips pressed into a firm line. She had done everything she could, expose the weak evidence, challenge the false assumptions. But was it enough? At long last, the bailiff entered, his voice cutting through the courtroom. The jury has reached a verdict. A murmur rippled through the audience. Victoria inhaled slowly. This was it. The jurors filed back in, their faces tense, unreadable. The foreman, an older man with weary eyes, unfolded a piece of paper. He cleared his throat. In the case of the state of Louisiana versus Daniel Carter, we find the defendant. The pause was unbearable. Not guilty. For a moment there was silence. Then a mix of gas, sighs of relief, and murmurs filled the room. Lauren closed her eyes briefly, exhaling. Daniel's shoulders sagged, but he didn't celebrate. He didn't even smile. He simply sat there staring straight ahead, as if unsure whether he was really free. Victoria tapped her gavel. Order! Her voice rang through the courtroom, bringing the chaos under control. She turned toward Daniel. Mr. Carter, you are free to go. The bailiff stepped forward and unlocked his cuffs. As the chains fell away, Daniel slowly rubbed his wrists, staring at the faint scars. The weight of the moment was too heavy for relief. The prosecutor, Richard Owens, sat still, his jaw clenched in frustration. He had lost, but Victoria could tell he wasn't convinced. Not convinced that justice had been served, but that a guilty man had walked free. She knew better. Daniel turned, stepping away from the defense table. But as he passed Victoria's bench, he hesitated. For the first time since the trial began, he lifted his gaze to meet hers. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in a quiet, steady voice, he asked, Why didn't you say anything? Victoria's stomach tightened. She had expected this. She knew he had recognized her the moment he stepped into the courtroom that first day. Why didn't you acknowledge me? Why did you pretend like we didn't know each other? Like we weren't once friends? She searched for the words. But what was she supposed to say? That she was protecting the integrity of the trial? That she had to remain neutral? That the law demanded distance even when her heart screamed for something else? Finally, she said, because I couldn't. Daniel's expression didn't change. His eyes, once full of warmth in their youth, now held something colder, more tired. You couldn't, he echoed. There was no anger in his voice, no bitterness, just resignation. He nodded slowly, then turned and walked away. Victoria sat frozen, watching him go. A familiar ache settled in her chest. She had upheld the law. But had she upheld justice? Outside the courthouse, Daniel took in a deep breath, feeling the weight of his first free air in weeks. Lauren stood beside him, her phone buzzing as reporters scrambled to get a statement. "How does it feel to win, Mr. Carter?" someone shouted. Daniel turned to Lauren, waiting for her to answer for him. But instead, she tilted her head. "This is your moment." Daniel exhaled. He looked directly at the cameras. "I didn't win." His voice was steady. "I just didn't lose." The reporters murmured, some confused, some understanding. "And what's next for you?" another asked. Daniel didn't know. He had spent his life fighting against accusations, against a system designed to swallow him whole. Now he was free, but freedom didn't erase the scars. The ones on his wrists, the ones in his mind. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I guess I start over." Lauren placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to do it alone." Daniel glanced at her, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. For the first time in a long time, someone had fought for him. Maybe he didn't win, but maybe, just maybe, he had a chance now. Back inside, Victoria remained at her bench long after the courtroom had emptied. Margaret, her assistant, peeked in. "Are you all right, Judge?" Victoria's fingers tightened around the gavel before setting it down. "Margaret, do you think we really serve justice, or just keep order?" Margaret hesitated. Then softly she said, "Depends on who's asking." "And who's answering?" Victoria nodded slowly, lost in thought. Daniel was free. But how many others wouldn't be? How many more people like him would be arrested, wrongly accused, stripped of their dignity, buried under evidence that told only one side of the story? She thought about the system she had sworn to uphold. She had believed in it, had spent her life believing it was meant to protect people. But today, for the first time, she wasn't so sure. The world had never been fair, not for Daniel, not for so many others. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop pretending that the law always meant justice. She took a deep breath, gathered her things, and stepped out into the night, knowing that this case was over, but her fight was just beginning. Justice isn't always about laws and verdicts. Sometimes it's about who is willing to stand up, to see the truth beyond the evidence, beyond the labels. And sometimes it's about asking ourselves, are we keeping order, or are we truly serving justice? If this story made you think, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave your thoughts below. Because stories like these matter. Justice is supposed to be fair, but as we've seen in this story, the reality is often far more complicated. Victoria Marshall upheld the law, but did she truly serve justice? The scars of the past, the weight of unspoken words, and the power of the system all played their part in shaping the fate of Daniel Carter. This isn't just a courtroom drama, it's a reflection of the world we live in. How many Daniels have been judged before their voices were even heard? How many Victorias have stood at the crossroads of duty and morality, forced to choose between what is right and what is expected? If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about the fine line between justice and injustice, let us know in the comments. Do you believe Victoria did the right thing? What would you have done in her place? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories that challenge perspectives and uncover hidden truths. Your voice matters, so share this video with someone who needs to hear this lesson. Thank you for watching, and remember, true justice begins when we refuse to stay silent.